There's a particular kind of courage that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't ride in on a white horse. It doesn't carry a banner or wear clean boots. It shows up at dawn, hair tangled from a 4-hour drive, wearing her dead father's jacket because it was the warmest thing left in the house, with nothing in her pocket but a handwritten list of everything her mother can no longer do for herself. I've kept a log for 31 years on this ranch. Birth records, death records, the weight of calves in January and the cost of hay in drought years. Numbers mostly, facts, things you can measure. I never thought I'd be writing about a girl named Wren Calloway. But here I am. She wasn't supposed to be here. Her mother was supposed to come, Helen Calloway, who'd signed a seasonal labor contract 6 weeks prior, who'd shaken Colt Mercer's hand on a Tuesday morning and said she'd be back before the first frost. Instead, her daughter showed up, knocked 3 times on the foreman's gate, and said 4 words that stopped a whole operation dead in its tracks. "Mom's sick, so I came." Just like that, no apology, no explanation beyond what was necessary. 17 years old, maybe 18, with dried mud on her boots and something fierce and terrified in equal measure sitting right behind her eyes. I wrote it down in my log that same hour. Something just arrived, not sure what it is yet, but it's got spine. What followed was 32 days I will spend the rest of my life trying to explain to people who weren't there, and failing every time. Because what happened on Colt Mercer's ranch that October wasn't just one girl proving herself. It was something older than that. Something about what happens when a person carries a weight they should never have had to carry, and carries it anyway, without asking anyone's permission to be strong. I've tried to write it 3 separate times. The morning she arrived, I was doing what I do every October 2nd, sitting on the equipment shed steps with a thermos of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, watching the sky turn from purple to iron gray, and making a list of everything that was behind schedule. We were behind on everything. The hay baling from the east pasture hadn't finished. 2 of our seasonal hands had quit 3 days prior over a dispute with one of Colt's newer foremen, a man named Deeks who had a talent for making capable people feel stupid. The cattle sorting for the fall sale was due to start in 4 days, and we were short 3 bodies minimum. My knees hurt. My coffee was cold. And somewhere up at the main house, Colt Mercer was probably eating a breakfast prepared by someone else and looking at spreadsheets that reduced all of my problems to line items. I'm not bitter about that. I want to be clear. I've worked for Colt going on 9 years, and he's a fair man, a hard man, occasionally an oblivious man in the way wealthy men sometimes are. Not cruel, just accustomed to distance from consequence. He delegates well, he pays well. I've stayed because the land is honest even when the business around it isn't always. But that morning I was tired, and I was short-handed, and I was making my list, and that's when I heard the sound. Gravel, slow, a vehicle that wasn't sure it was welcome. I looked up and saw a truck I didn't recognize, a '98 Ford Ranger with a cracked taillight and what appeared to be a blue tarp secured over something in the bed with 3 different kinds of rope. The truck pulled up to the foreman's gate, not the main house entrance, not the guest circle, the foreman's gate, which told me immediately that whoever was driving had done some research, or had been told exactly where to go. The truck stopped, engine ran for a moment, then cut out. The door opened. She was young, that was the first thing. Young in a way that has a specific texture to it, not naive, not inexperienced, but carrying a newness to hard things that hasn't yet calcified into indifference. She was wearing a canvas work jacket that was at least 2 sizes too large men's cut, olive green, with a tear at the left elbow that had been sewn back with heavy thread in a slightly different shade. Work boots, real ones, not the decorative kind. Dark jeans. Hair pulled back in a braid that had come mostly undone on one side, and she hadn't bothered to fix it. She looked at me. I looked at her. She said, "I'm looking for Mr. Prout, the foreman." "You found him." "I'm Wren Calloway, Helen Calloway's daughter. My mother signed a seasonal contract here about 6 weeks ago. She was supposed to report day before yesterday." She paused, just a fraction, the kind of pause that costs something. "She can't come, she's sick, I'm here instead." I want to write down that I was gracious about what happened next. I wasn't. "Miss Calloway," I said, keeping my voice even because I was raised to keep my voice even. "The contract is with your mother. It specifies certain skills, certain physical requirements, and a liability arrangement tied to her name. I can't just." "I know," she said. I read the contract. You read? I read it twice, actually. There's nothing in it that's non-transferable by nature. The skills section lists livestock handling, fence repair, feeding rotation, and hay management. I can do all of those. She reached into the inside pocket of the oversized jacket and produced a folded piece of paper. I wrote out what I've done specifically and where. References are on the back. The second one is Bud Farrow over in Claxton. He had 300 head of Angus Cross, and I worked his sorting for 2 consecutive falls. You can call him before you say no. She held the paper out. I stared at it. I am 61 years old, and I have been a ranch foreman since I was 30. In that time, I have been handed a lot of papers by a lot of people who wanted something from me. Most of them were people trying to seem more prepared than they were. This paper, when I took it, and I did take it, if only because refusing it felt suddenly rude, was different. It was handwritten, yes, but organized. Skills on the left, duration and volume on the right, 3 references with phone numbers. At the bottom, in smaller writing, she'd added, I am aware I am not who you expected. I am asking you to evaluate what I can do, not who I am. I folded it back along its original creases. How old are you? 21. She didn't hesitate. I noted that. I also noted that 21 was exactly the minimum working age listed in the liability clause of our seasonal contracts. Your mother, I said, how sick? The first crack, just a small one, a tightening at the corners of her eyes that happened fast and was controlled fast. But I saw it. In 31 years of log keeping, I've learned to watch for the things people don't mean to show. She has an infection in her left lung, Wren said. The doctors think it'll clear, she's stable, but she can't work for at least 3 to 4 weeks and she needs medication that costs. She stopped, started again. She needs medication, and we need the income from this contract to cover it and the rent both. There it was, the whole architecture of the situation, laid out in 2 sentences, with no decoration and no request for sympathy. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I looked at my cold coffee. Then I looked back at my list, which was still sitting on the step beside me, every item on it still incomplete. I'm not a sentimental man. I want that on record. I have made a long career of separating what a situation requires from what a situation makes me feel, because conflating the two is how foremen make bad decisions and ranches have bad years. What I did next was not sentiment. It was inventory. I needed 3 bodies. I had 1 body standing in front of me who had a reference from Bud Farrow, who was one of the most demanding cattlemen in Claxton County and not known for generosity with his praise. Get back in your truck, I said. Her jaw set, Mr. Prout, and drive it around to the equipment yard behind the main barn. There's a skills assessment we run on new hands. It takes about 2 hours. If you pass it, we'll talk about a temporary arrangement pending a call to Bud Farrow. I picked up my cold coffee. Don't make me say it twice. She didn't. She was back in the truck before I'd finished the sentence. I should explain Mercer Ridge for anyone who hasn't been here. It is not a small operation. Colt Mercer's grandfather started it with 300 acres and a modest herd in 1951, and what stands now is somewhere north of 4,000 acres, a certified Angus beef program, a hay operation, a small quarter-horse breeding side business, and the kind of infrastructure: barns, equipment sheds, grain storage, staff housing, veterinary facility. That takes decades and significant capital to build. Colt himself came into full ownership 12 years ago when his father had a stroke and decided that retirement was better than a second one. He is not, as some people in the county assume, a man who simply inherited wealth and sat on it. He works. Not always the same work I do. He works at the level of decisions and capital and markets and relationships. But he is present. He understands what the land requires, and he has a genuine feeling for cattle that you can't fake if you spend time around him. What Colt is not good at is people who aren't already part of his world. He is not unkind. He is not arrogant in any deliberate way. But he grew up rich and grew up ranching simultaneously, which creates a particular blind spot, a tendency to see the operation before the person, the function before the human being performing it. He'd hired Helen Calloway because she had the right skills and came at the right price during a seasonal crunch. He hadn't, as far as I know, asked anything about her life beyond what the contract required. I thought about this while I watched Wren Calloway do the skills assessment. The assessment isn't complicated, but it isn't easy. We run new hands through 4 stations, haltering and leading a moderately uncooperative horse, basic fence repair on a section of post and wire we keep specifically damaged for this purpose, identifying feed issues in 2 sample troughs, one with moldy hay, one with correct mix, and loading a hay bale onto a truck bed using a 2-person system. But we only give them 1 person to see how they adapt. She haltered the horse, a big roan we call Consequence, because he is difficult and has unseated 4 people in the past year. In under 4 minutes using a left shoulder approach I hadn't seen done correctly in a while. She didn't fight him. She moved with his uncertainty, stepped back twice when he threw his head, and waited him out with the lead rope loose in her hand until he decided to stop being dramatic. Fence repair, clean. She replaced the wire tension without being told to check the staple placement, which most people skip. Feed assessment got both right. Identified the mold by smell before she even looked closely at the hay and said, quietly to herself, not performing it, "That's not right," like she was simply noting a fact. Hay bale, she looked at the bale, looked at the truck bed height, looked at the equipment around her, and without any apparent distress went and found a loading ramp we keep in the corner of the yard, leaned it against the bed, and rolled the bale up. 45 seconds. I wrote 1 word in my log. Competent. Then, because I keep an honest log, more than competent, trained by someone who was serious. I called Bud Farrow while she waited. He picked up on the 3rd ring in the middle of something loud. When I said Helen Calloway's daughter, he went quiet for a second and then said, "You put her to work, Elias. She's better than half the grown men I've hired in the last decade, and she doesn't make noise about it." That was enough. I gave her the seasonal housing, a small unit in the staff row, 2 rooms, a bathroom that worked mostly a propane heater, and walked her through the rotation schedule she'd be joining. Morning feeding at 5:30. Sorting support starting in 3 days, fence patrol on alternating afternoons. The pay was the same as her mother's contract, which wasn't generous but was fair. She listened to all of it without writing anything down. "You'll want to write that down," I said. "I won't forget it." She didn't, as it turned out, but I didn't know that yet. What I knew, standing in that small housing unit, while she set her 1 bag on the floor and looked around with the particular expression of someone cataloging what a space requires rather than what it provides, was that I had made a practical decision and was going to have to tell Colt Mercer about it. That conversation I was not looking forward to. Colt's office is in the main house, in a corner room that faces east over the front pasture. He keeps it sparse. A desk, a map, a whiteboard with livestock numbers, a small photo of his parents that he's never commented on directly. He was at the desk when I came in, going over the fall sale projections, and he listened to me without interrupting, which is one of his better qualities. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You ran her through the assessment." "Full assessment?" "And Farrow vouched for her?" "Directly." He looked out the window. Something moved across his face that I couldn't entirely read. "How old is she?" 21, I held his gaze. He held mine. He knew what that pause meant. He's not stupid. But he let it go, which told me something about where his head was. "Fine," he said. "Your call, you're short, and you know what we need." He looked back at the projections. "Keep me informed." I left before he could change his mind. What I didn't know then was that Colt Mercer was going to spend the next 3 days watching Ren Calloway work from various distances. From the upstairs window, from the fence line, from the seat of a tractor he didn't need to drive, with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. I noticed. I wrote it down. He's looking at something he doesn't have a category for yet. The first week on any operation tells you what a person is made of. Not because anything dramatic happens. Usually it doesn't. But because the daily grind has a way of revealing the exact gap between what someone said they could do and what they actually do. Ren Calloway had no gap. She was at the feeding station at 5:15 every morning, which was 15 minutes before required, because she'd identified in the first 2 days that the water lines to the north pasture feeders had a slow drain issue and needed an extra check before the automated fill cycle. She mentioned it to me on day 3 with a hand-drawn sketch of the line configuration and where she thought the partial blockage was. I had the maintenance crew look at it. She was right. We fixed it before it became a winter problem. Deeks, the foreman I mentioned earlier, the one who'd driven 2 hands to quit, Came across her in the second week while she was doing fence patrol on the South Range. I heard about this secondhand from one of the other seasonal hands, and then confirmed it with Wren herself when she came in that evening. Deeks had told her the fence section she was patching was wrong, that she'd need to redo it, that she'd missed a post. Wren had looked at the post, looked at him, and said, "The post is set. Check the base if you want, but the concrete didn't cure wrong." Deeks had pushed. Wren had said, quietly, "I'll let Mr. Prout look at it." She'd come to find me. I'd gone to look. The post was set correctly. The concrete had cured fine. "Did he give you more trouble about it?" I asked. "He said I had an attitude." "Do you?" She looked at me with those steady eyes. "I have an opinion about whether the post was wrong." "That's different." I wrote it in the log. She knows the difference between confidence and defiance. Most people don't at 21 or 40. What I didn't write down, because it felt like something that shouldn't go in an operations log, was the one moment I observed late in the first week that I've thought about more than anything else from that whole 32 days. It was evening, past the dinner hour. The yard was quiet, most of the hands in their units. I was doing a final check of the equipment shed when I passed the small window of the staff housing unit where she was staying. The curtains were thin and the light was on. She was sitting on the edge of the bed with her phone to her ear, not talking, listening. And she was crying, silently, in the way that people cry when they've had a lot of practice not letting anyone see. Head slightly down, one hand in her lap still. Not wiping her face, just letting it happen because she was alone and couldn't hold it back any longer. She said something, just a few words. I couldn't hear them through the glass, but I could see her mouth. I think she said, "I know, Mama, I know." Then she straightened her spine, wiped her face with the back of her wrist, and reached for what looked like a notebook on the bed beside her and opened it to a page covered in handwriting. I walked away from that window. I didn't write it in the operations log, but I've written it here because it's the most important thing I saw in those first 10 days, maybe the most important thing I saw in all 32, because that moment was the load-bearing wall of everything that followed. The whole structure of who Wren Calloway was and what she was doing here rested on that single nightly ritual of allowing herself to break in private and then picking up the notebook and going back to the list. She was not fearless. She was afraid every single day. She just refused to let the fear drive. On day 10, Colt Mercer came down to the south pasture, where the sorting operation had started, and spent 2 hours working alongside the hands. This wasn't unusual. He did it a few times each season, but the particular 2 hours he chose happened to be the same 2 hours that Wren was working the gate on the sorting chute. Gate work on a sorting chute is a specific skill. You have to read cattle movement, anticipate where an animal will commit, open and close the gate in a rhythm that's fast enough to keep flow but precise enough not to allow wrong direction animals through. It's the kind of job that looks simple until you watch someone who's actually good at it, and then it looks almost musical. She was good at it. I watched Colt watching her from about 20 feet away. He was supposed to be checking on the count with one of the hands, but for a solid 4 minutes, he was just watching the gate work. The kind of watching that isn't casual. Later that afternoon, he found me by the equipment shed. "The Calloway girl," he said, not a question. "What about her?" "She's better than Rodriguez was, and Rodriguez had 7 years on us." "I know." He was quiet for a second, turned his hat in his hands, a habit he has when something is sitting with him. "What's her situation at home?" "Sick mother," I said, "needs the income." He nodded slowly, that expression again. The one I'd been watching for 10 days and couldn't quite name. Not pity, not admiration exactly, something more complicated, the look of a man who is encountering something his money can't explain and isn't sure what to do about that. "She eating?" he asked. I blinked. "Beg pardon." "The staff kitchen's open to seasonals at lunch. Has she been using it?" I thought about it. I hadn't seen her at the communal lunch table. Now that I thought about it, I'd seen her eat twice. Once in the equipment yard with what appeared to be a sandwich she'd brought, once sitting on the fence rail of the north pasture with something wrapped in foil. "I don't think so." His jaw tightened slightly, not anger, something else. "Make sure she knows the lunch table is there," he said. Then he walked away. I stood there for a moment. Then I opened my log and wrote, "He's starting to see her." Not as a function, as a person, 10 days in. I don't know yet if that's good or complicated. Not the weather, though that matters too, especially in October, especially in this part of the country where the difference between a calm blue sky and a 3-day blow can be about 14 hours. I mean the internal temperature, the mood of the operation, the way people move around each other, the friction or lack of it, the small daily negotiations of space and effort and dignity that add up over a season to either a functional crew or a fracturing one. In the second week of Ren Calloway's time at Mercer Ridge, the temperature changed. Not dramatically, not in the way that announces itself. It shifted the way a room shifts when someone enters who changes the weight distribution. Everyone adjusts slightly without necessarily knowing why. Part of it was Deke's. After the fence post incident, he'd pulled back from direct friction with Ren, but he'd started doing something subtler, excluding her from the daily briefings he ran for the sorting crew. Not obviously, never overtly, so there was nothing clean to call out. He'd give assignments verbally to the group while she was at a slightly different position, or he'd post the afternoon rotation on the board in the equipment shed at a time when she was in the field. Small navigational obstacles designed to make her work harder for the same information everyone else got automatically. She adapted every time, found out the schedule another way, asked the right people, showed up exactly where she needed to be. But it was costing her energy she needed elsewhere. I know because by the end of the second week, she was making an error she hadn't made before, a small one, the kind that comes from fatigue rather than incompetence. During the evening feeding rotation, she'd miscounted the supplement buckets for the yearling pen, left one short for the far corner. It wasn't caught until the next morning when one of the other hands noticed an animal that'd been jostled out of the feeding order. No harm done, correctable, but she caught it herself before I said anything, came to me at 6:15 in the morning with the correction already made and said, "I undercounted the yearling supplement last night. I've fixed it. I'll double-check that station going forward." No excuse, no explanation. Ownership clean and immediate. "What happened?" I asked, because I wanted to know if she'd tell me the truth. She considered for a moment. "I was tired. I let myself get distracted counting and moved too fast." "Anything specific make you tired?" Her eyes flicked toward the direction of Deke's office in the main barn. Just a fraction, just enough, then back to me. "I've been carrying some extra load to get information I should be getting automatically. I'll manage it better." "Or," I said carefully, "I can manage the source of the problem." She shook her head. "It's not necessary. I don't want to be the person who needs intervention. I want to be the person who handles it." I wrote it in the log, pride, not the destructive kind, the kind that's load-bearing. I did speak to Deeks regardless. Briefly and without room for argument. I told him that information exclusion was a management failure on his part, not a discipline tool, and that I'd be doing a random review of his briefing attendance records. He didn't like it. I didn't need him to like it. What happened as a result of that conversation was that Deeks pulled back entirely from the sorting operation. Petulant, but practical, and Ren's performance returned to where it had been in the first week. By the 15th of October, she was the most reliable person on my sorting crew. Colt came to the south pasture again on the 16th. But this time he wasn't there for the operation. He'd come, as best I could tell, specifically because Ren was doing a post-sort check of the yearling section, and he'd timed his walk to bring him past that area. I watched from a distance. Not intrusively, I was doing my own check of the water infrastructure on the west side, but the angles gave me a clear line of sight to the fence where they ended up standing. He approached her directly. That was new. He'd watched her from a distance for 2 weeks, and now he was walking toward her specifically, which told me that something internal had shifted for him. I couldn't hear the conversation. What I could see was, he said something, she turned from her work to look at him without any visible deference or nervousness. She responded, he said something else. She almost smiled. Not quite, just a softening at one corner of her mouth. And then they stood there for a few minutes with both of them looking at the yearlings rather than at each other. That's a specific posture between two people. The looking away together posture. It happens when the subject of conversation has moved from transactional to something slightly less defined. I wrote in the log they talked. Real conversation, don't know the content yet, he initiated. I found out the content later, in 2 stages. The first stage was from Wren herself, who mentioned it matter-of-factly the following morning when I stopped by the yearling pen. "Mr. Mercer came by," she said, not looking up from what she was doing. "I know, what did he want?" "He asked about the mold issue I flagged in the second week. Said the maintenance crew had told him about it and he wanted to know how I'd caught it." She paused. "I told him I smelled it. And he seemed surprised that I'd said anything at all, like he'd expected a different kind of answer." She straightened and looked at me with a directness that was becoming familiar. "He asked if there was anything else I'd noticed that needed attention." "And you told him?" "I told him the west drainage on the yearling pen slopes wrong, and it's going to ice over in the first hard freeze. I told him the third gate on the north sorting chute has a latch that's binding and someone's going to get a hand caught. And I told him the propane gauge in staff unit 4 is reading wrong. It's showing full, but I tested the output, and it's running low, which means someone's going to lose heat in the middle of the night without warning." I stared at her. "All things I'd planned to bring to you today," she added, "but he was there. 3 infrastructure issues, all legitimate, all things that would have become problems within 2 to 3 weeks. I confirmed all 3 by the end of that day. The second stage of the conversation's content I learned from Colt himself. He stopped me in the main barn that evening, and unlike his usual operational communication, which is efficient and purposeful, he seemed to be taking longer to get to the point. "She gave me 3 infrastructure notes," he said. "I know, I confirmed them. She was right on all 3. He stopped, started again. "She's not doing the minimum." "No. She's treating this place like it's hers to take care of." I didn't answer that directly. I said, "She's treating it like it matters." He turned his hat in his hands. "What do you know about the mother, Helen?" "Lung infection, stable but slow recovery. The contract income is covering medication and rent. That's the only income for both of them, as far as I know." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought the conversation was over and started to move. "Elias," he said my name with a weight that made me stop. "Does she know the contract ends October 28th? I turned back. "She knows." "Does she know what happens after that?" I didn't answer, because the honest answer was that after October 28th, under the terms of the contract, there was no further work until spring, and I didn't know what that meant for the Calloway situation. Colt nodded slowly, not at me, at something inside himself. "Okay," he said in a tone that suggested he'd just made a decision. Then he walked away. "I want to write about what happened on October 18th with honesty, because I've been thinking about it for weeks, and it resists the kind of clean narrative that's tempting to impose on it after the fact." Wren had been calling her mother every evening since she arrived. I knew this because of the window I'd passed, and because one of the other housing unit residents had mentioned hearing the phone calls through the thin walls. Quiet, brief, regular. On the evening of the 18th, the call wasn't brief. I know this because I was doing a late equipment check, and the light in her unit was still on at 10 o'clock, which was unusual. She was typically up before 5 and asleep before 9. And when I passed, I could hear, not words, but the pitch of a conversation that had shifted. Higher, tighter. I kept walking. At 5:15 the next morning, she was at the feeding station as always. There was nothing visible in her face or her work that indicated anything had changed. At noon, she came to find me in the equipment shed. "I need to ask you something," she said. Her voice was level in the way that things are level when someone has been working very hard to make them level. "Ask." "If I needed to take 2 days away, if there was an emergency at home, would there be a way to make that work, within the contract terms?" "What kind of emergency?" "My mother had a setback. The infection got into a second area of the lung. The pause, the familiar small tightening around the eyes. "She's not critical. But she's alone and she had a bad night and I need to." "Wren," I said her name quietly. She stopped. "2 days is fine, we'll manage." She looked at me with an expression that was almost anger. Not at me, at herself, I think, for the tears that arrived suddenly and had to be contained through visible effort. She pressed her lips together and looked at the equipment shed ceiling for a moment and then looked back at me. "I'll make up the hours," she said. "You don't need to." "I want to." "Okay." She turned to leave, stopped, turned back. There's a note in the yearling pen corner, left post, folded in the gap with everything that needs watching while I'm gone, feeding notes and the infrastructure checks I do. She met my eyes. In case anyone needs it. She'd written the coverage notes before she'd asked my permission to leave. I wrote it in the log that evening, sitting on my steps with coffee that was actually hot for once. She doesn't wait to be given permission to be responsible. She assumes it, like breathing. I genuinely do not know what her life was like before she got here, but someone taught her, or circumstance taught her, or she taught herself. Either way, the result is the same. She left this morning at 11, said she'd be back by Thursday. She was back Wednesday night. She returned a day early. Drove back in the dark, pulled into the equipment yard at 9:47 at night. I know the time because I was still up, back problem, couldn't sleep, and I heard the truck and looked out and confirmed it. She sat in the truck for about 4 minutes before she got out. I don't know what that 4 minutes was. I didn't watch it closely. It felt like something private. The next morning, she was at the feeding station at 5:15. I didn't ask about the trip until she offered it, which happened 3 days later when we were doing a fence check together on the North Range. She's better, Ren said, not looking up from the wire she was checking. Not good yet, but better. The doctor changed the medication. A pause. She cried when I left, said she was sorry I was doing all this. What did you say? Ren was quiet for a moment. Her hands kept moving on the fence wire, checking, pressing, reading the tension with her fingertips. I said, Mom, this is just what we do. And then I got in the truck before she could answer. I didn't ask anything else. But I wrote it down. The conversation between Ren and Colt that happened on October 21st, I only know about partially, from my own observation, and from what Colt told me afterward, which was measured and careful in the way that men are careful when they're describing something that affected them more than they want to admit. He'd gone down to the south pasture in the late afternoon, when the light was turning that particular October gold that makes the land look like something from a painting that couldn't possibly be real. Ren was doing an end-of-day check of the sorting infrastructure, the thing she always checked, that she'd started checking without being asked. He'd asked her directly what her plans were after the contract ended. She'd told him directly that she hadn't figured that out yet. He'd said, and this is what he told me so I can only report it in his words, he'd said, there's a possibility I want to discuss, not charity, a restructured offer, based on what I've seen. And she'd said, what have you seen? He said he hadn't expected the question, had expected her to want to hear the offer first. But she'd asked what he'd seen, and so he'd answered honestly, which he described as harder than it should have been for some reason. He said, someone who takes care of things that aren't theirs to take care of, because she thinks they matter. And Ren had looked at him, this is how Colt described it, with an expression that was complicated in a way he couldn't fully decode. Not pleased, not deflecting, something careful. She'd said, I'd like to hear the offer. He'd made it a full-year junior foreman position, training provisions, advancement tied to performance, salary significantly above seasonal rate enough to cover the medication and the rent and then some, staff housing included. She'd listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Then she said, I need to think about it. He'd said, okay. She'd said, and I need to be able to bring my mother here, to recover. If I'm going to be here full-time, I'm not leaving her alone. He'd said, and this is what surprised him enough to tell me about it, he'd said yes before he'd really finished processing the sentence, like the answer had arrived before the consideration. He told me this the following morning, standing in the main barn, turning his hat in his hands as he always did. She said she needs to think, he said. She will, I told him. Is that, he stopped himself, tried again. Is that a yes with extra steps, or is it actually still open? I looked at him for a moment. 9 years I'd worked for this man, and I'd never seen him uncertain about a decision involving the ranch. Not like this. Not with this specific quality of uncertainty, which wasn't about the business case, but about something else entirely. I think, I said carefully, that she's lived long enough in a situation where decisions had consequences she couldn't afford to get wrong, and so she doesn't make them fast, even when she already knows the answer. He nodded. I went back to the equipment shed. I opened the log and I wrote, he sees her now. Fully, not the function, the person. And he doesn't know what to do with the fact that the sight of her, working and careful and carrying all of that without asking for relief, has gotten under something in him that the ranch hadn't touched in a long time. I don't think this is my story to analyze. I'm just the one keeping the record. She told me her answer on the morning of October 23rd. Not Colt, me. She told me first, which I thought was significant and which I wrote down before anything else. It was early before feeding, when the yard was still gray and cold, and the horses in the near paddock were making their quiet morning sounds. She came and stood beside me where I was starting the equipment shed inventory, and she said, "I'm going to take it." "I know," I said. She looked at me sideways. "Did you?" "Bud Farrow told me once that you'd been offered a position at his operation twice and turned it down. I figured if you were still looking for the right place, you'd know it when you found it." She was quiet for a moment. "He told you that?" Called me back after I called for the reference. Said he'd wanted to make sure I knew what I was getting. She looked out across the yard at nothing in particular. Something moved through her face that I can only describe as a private acknowledgement, like she was internally marking a moment. "I'm going to call Colt this morning," she said, "after feeding. He'll be at the east barn until about 8. "Okay," she pulled on her gloves, started for the feeding station, stopped, turned back. "Elias. Rend. Did you, when I came with that paper the first morning, did you know then?" I considered. I keep an honest log, and I was going to keep an honest conversation. "I thought you might be something unusual. I didn't know what kind of unusual yet." She nodded slowly. "That's fair. You were very prepared." "I've learned that being prepared is the one thing I have full control over." She walked away to start the feeding. I stood there for a moment. Then I opened the log and wrote, she said yes. She's telling him this morning. The chapter closes here, the contract chapter anyway, something else begins. The conversation with Colt happened at 8:15 at the East Barn. I wasn't present, but I could see it from the equipment shed window. Another angle, another set of glass between me and something I had no right to be inside of. I watched them stand on opposite sides of a fence rail the way that people do when they're not quite ready to remove any remaining distance. Her facing him. Him with one boot on the lower rail, looking at her directly with an attention that I'd watched build over 32 days from observation to something much less comfortable and much more honest. She talked, he listened. He responded, she responded. At some point he reached out and rested his hand on the fence rail between them, not touching her, just placing his hand in the shared geography. And she looked at it, and then looked at him and said something that made him exhale slowly and look away and then look back. They shook hands. Not a business handshake, or not only a business handshake. One of those extended handshakes that is technically a handshake but functionally something more, where the grip holds a beat longer than necessary and neither party immediately moves to look away. I wrote, "Done, she's staying." Then I went back to inventory. What happened in the last 10 days of October was a recalibration. Not dramatic, these things rarely are when they're real. It was more like watching a mechanical system that had been running with a misaligned component finally get adjusted, a series of small smoothings that accumulated into a different kind of function. Ren moved from seasonal housing to the permanent staff unit on the east side of the main barn complex. It was larger, 2 proper rooms, a kitchen alcove, a south-facing window that got afternoon light. She moved in one afternoon while continuing to complete her daily assignments. The actual move took about 20 minutes, which told me what I already suspected. She traveled light by habit, not choice. Helen Calloway arrived on October 26th. I wasn't there for the arrival. I was in the field when the truck came. But one of the other hands told me that Colt had been at the main gate when she drove in, that he'd helped her with the one suitcase she had, that she'd thanked him in a voice that was still rough with the tail end of illness, and that he'd said something short that made her stop and look at him and then nod. I asked Ren later what he'd said. She took a moment before answering. He said, "Your daughter fixed 3 things in the first 2 weeks that would have cost us significantly before winter. We're glad she came." I digested that, and your mother. Ren's expression, there was a whole weather system in it for about 3 seconds. She said, "That sounds like her." I wrote it in the log. Not as an operations note, as a record. Deeks resigned at the end of October. I won't spend much time on this. The short version is that his continued obstruction of a now permanent staff member had become untenable, and when I made clear to him what the new organizational reality was, he decided the situation didn't suit him and gave notice. He was gone by November 1st. I'm not certain Ren knew this was connected to her. I didn't tell her. She didn't ask. She mentioned the following week that the daily briefings had become more straightforward, and I said that sometimes personnel changes improve information flow, and she said, yes, they do, in a tone that was diplomatically neutral and may have contained a small private satisfaction. I left that out of the log. Some things don't need to be in the record. I need to write about the evening of October 29th, because it's the moment the whole thing resolved into something I could actually see clearly, and because it surprised me, not the event itself, but the quality of it, the quietness of it. The fall sale had wrapped 2 days prior, successfully. Colt had come down after the final loadout and shaken hands with the entire crew, which he did every year. When he got to Ren, he'd held the handshake for a moment and said something I was close enough to hear. Your gate work on the 3rd day of sorting was the best I've seen on that shoot in 8 years. She'd said I had good cattle. He'd laughed, actually laughed, which was rare enough that 3 other people nearby looked over. On the 29th, I was doing my end-of-day log in the equipment shed. The sun going down, the yard going quiet, that specific peace that settles over a working ranch when the day's work is genuinely done, when I heard footsteps outside. 2 sets unequal, one lighter, one heavier, voices low. I looked through the shed window. Ren and Colt were walking along the fence line of the east pasture in the last light, not going anywhere specific, just walking. She had her hands in the pockets of that oversized canvas jacket. He had his hat in his hand rather than on his head, which is a specific Colt Mercer behavior that I've learned over 9 years to associate with moments when he's not performing anything, not being the employer, not being the rancher, not being the person in charge of the operation. Just being a man walking next to someone whose company is altering something in him. I watched for a minute, maybe 2. Then I turned away. I wrote in the log last light, they're walking the east fence, not operational, personal. I've been keeping this log for 31 years. I write down what I see because seeing clearly is the job. What I see tonight is 2 people who encountered each other sideways, under circumstances that were hard and honest, and without any of the usual protections people use when they're first deciding whether to trust, and who are now, at the end of a difficult month, choosing to walk in the same direction. That's not a management note, that's something else. I'll let it be what it is. I need to write about the phone call Ren made on November 1st, because she told me about it herself, unprompted, and because I think she told me because she needed it to exist somewhere outside of herself. It was her mother she called, from the east pasture, sitting on the fence rail in the early afternoon when it was just warm enough if you faced south. She'd told her mother about the full offer. The year-round position, the housing, the salary, all of it. Her mother had cried. Not sad crying, Ren said, telling me this while we walked the north perimeter. The other kind. Relief. Partly, she pulled her jacket tighter. She said she'd prayed for something like this. I told her I hadn't prayed, I'd just done the work and hoped the work was enough. A pause. She said those were the same thing. I didn't comment on the theology, I just walked. I told her I was happy, Ren said quietly, almost not to me. I don't say that very much. It didn't feel right to say it while she was sick and I was trying to just solve the problem, but I said it. Was it true? She thought about that. Genuinely in the way she did everything, actually considered it rather than giving the quick answer. It's more complicated than happy, but yes, underneath the complicated, yes. We walked the rest of the perimeter without talking. I've written 32 days of log entries about Ren Calloway, and I've tried to keep them honest, which means I've also kept them incomplete, because honesty requires acknowledging that there are things I can't see and things I don't have the right to report. What I can say, as a foreman who keeps careful records, the North Pasture water line is functioning correctly for the first time in 2 years. The west drainage on the yearling pen has been regraded and will not ice over. The sorting chute 3rd gate has a new latch. The staff unit propane gauge has been replaced. The fall sale numbers were the best in 3 years, in part because of the most efficient sorting operation we've run in my tenure. The information flow through the crew has improved significantly since the 1st of November. These are the operational facts. What doesn't go in the operations log, but what I'm putting here in this document that is mine to keep honest, is the rest. A girl drove 4 hours in a cracked taillight truck because her mother couldn't. She knocked on the right gate because she'd done her research. She handed over a piece of paper that said, essentially, "See what I can do before you decide what I am." She fixed things that weren't hers to fix because she thought they mattered. She cried alone at night and picked up her notebook and went back to the list. She made an emergency trip home and came back a day early. She asked for nothing she hadn't earned. She said yes to an offer that changed her situation and brought her mother to safety, and she said it only after she'd thought about it carefully, because she'd lived long enough with consequences to know that fast decisions are a privilege. And somewhere in those 32 days, the man who owns this land, who is good at it, who is fair at it, who is sometimes insulated by it in ways he doesn't entirely see, started walking alongside someone who showed him what it looked like to work without a net. I don't know where that goes. I'm 61 years old. I've kept 31 years of logs. I've seen a lot of things arrive at this ranch, and I've kept the record of them as cleanly as I can. This one was different. I'll end the log here because the story, the part that has a shape, has ended. What comes next is something else. Something that'll make its own shape in its own time and won't need my record to be real. On November 3rd, I was sitting on the equipment shed steps in the early morning, thermos in hand. The coffee was hot. The sky was doing the thing it does in November, that specific silver that isn't quite dawn yet and isn't quite night anymore. I heard footsteps. Wren came across the yard at 5:15, exactly on time, wearing her father's jacket with the elbow sewn in mismatched thread, her braid already coming undone on one side. She was carrying something, a coffee thermos of her own, which was new. She glanced over at me and gave me a nod, the small economical nod of someone who has become part of a place and doesn't need to announce it anymore.